To everyone who's joining us today. This is a really amazing group of people that you're about to learn with and from, and just an amazing array of experiences and resources. And so we hope after we go through this first part of introducing ourselves that you'll be starting to think of the kinds of questions that you have, because this is a rare opportunity. We'll be using the chat function to gather questions, and so please type in your questions there and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And if there's a specific person you have a question for, please include that. So I would just invite our group to introduce themselves to the gathered, and let's start first with Alistair.
Thanks very much, Steve. And can I just clarify, are you wanting us to talk about reconciliation in this initial introduction?
Yes, please say something about your understanding of reconciliation as you introduce yourself.
Thank you. So my name's Alistair Mackay. I'm the director of a small charity and a not-for-profit organisation that's based at Coventry Cathedral called Reconciliation Initiatives, running a training and development programme with church leaders here in the UK, and potentially in the future running a similar program in Africa. So I guess I've got a few convictions about reconciliation that would be starting places for me. So one is to see that my understanding of reconciliation is closely linked to my understanding of God as a God of justice and righteousness. And I don't think I can talk about reconciliation without talking about issues of justice and injustice and inequality in the world. A second thing would be that I always see reconciliation in this life as something provisional, and that it's only in the next life, in heaven, that we will see really what reconciliation looks like. We can work on a journey towards greater reconciliation in this life, but we can never really fully experience it. We can have a taste of it, but we can't have the full banquet. A third thing I would say is that reconciliation, I think, operates at least 6 different levels. So first, at an intrapersonal level within oneself, at an interpersonal level between people, at an institutional and organizational level, at a national and societal level, at an international and global level, and at a cosmic level. And I think if we're to understand reconciliation from a biblical perspective, we need to embrace all of those levels, and to avoid an over-focus on the kind of interpersonal, which is often where the temptation is to focus. We need a systemic and structural perspective on issues of justice to really be able to explore reconciliation faithfully. And then the last thing I would say is that I see reconciliation is always both a journey and also a destination. And that as a journey, it's always a journey through conflict. And so again, that would be another piece that for me is interwoven with understanding reconciliation, is working with and through and finding a way to handle conflict within our lives and within the world.
Thank you very much. Chuck, would you please go next?
Delighted to. I'm Chuck Robertson. I am the canon to Presiding Bishop Michael Curry, with a focus on mission beyond the Episcopal Church. I also have the privilege of teaching as a visiting professor at General Theological Seminary, and I'm a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, working in the religion and global policy area. I really appreciate what you just said, Alistair, and I'm interested to hear what all of our colleagues here say about that. I love the fact of saying that reconciliation is provisional. I would say it's also just, as you said, aspirational, a goal to go for. But I certainly think that what I will be sharing in some of my time is part of the work is also to know the limits. Even from scripture, I love the fact that Jesus talked about sometimes having to wipe the dust off our feet and keep moving. Not to pick up a rock and throw it at someone as we move, but to keep moving, to see who can walk with us in this. Because the fact is, so much of this is about conflict management, not resolution. And so folks think reconciliation, resolution, it's done, it's great. They're going to be sorely disappointed, But rather, if we think about this as, okay, where are we in the midst of a relationship? Where are we in the midst of potential tension or conflict? Then what can be done at that stage to help build more bridges and walls and to find a way to see what reconciliation might look like at that stage? And the fact is, what is good at one stage may actually backfire if we're at a later stage in conflict. And so I think it's very important as we move forward to continually be detectives and ask, what's going on at this point? What's happening right now? And what are the tools we can use now? What are the tools we don't want to use now that might actually work against us? So it is as much an art as it is a science. In fact, probably more so. And I'll be fascinated to see how we, in our conversation, go deeper into some of those facets.
Great, thank you. Leah.
Thank you. My name is Leah Shimada. It's really wonderful to be with you today. I work professionally as a mediator in both secular and faith-based contexts. I also serve as the Associate Chaplain of the University of Roehampton in London, where I conduct research on practical theology. As both a theologian and a mediator, I have a long-standing interest in community dialogue, particularly where it intersects with questions of diversity and what this might mean for reconciliation. This was really what brought me to the conversation today. I came to mediation initially through Northern Ireland, where I spent several years working with the peace-building process. I held a remit working with communities on both sides of the divide to tackle issues of racism. And I came away with, I think, a couple of realizations that have shaped my thinking about reconciliation. Firstly, it's that for peace building to work, it needs to look beyond addressing merely the status quo of our traditional understanding of a conflict. And the second realization, which actually I'm reminded of continually in my day-to-day work as a mediator, is that you can have the most beautiful vision in the world, and a lot of people might call this reconciliation, but you will have no hope of reaching it without the sheer hard graft of conversations. And by this, I mean difficult, time-consuming, person-to-person conversations. Before we began, Steve asked us for our definition of reconciliation, and I'm actually going to be a bit provocative and resist offering a definition right now. I think increasingly that some words are better off given the freedom to migrate. Our traditional understanding of reconciliation is usually one of restoration. But sometimes, actually, a lot of times, the past is a place of profound injustice, which Alistair alluded to. And that place is usually just not worth restoring. So why bother? To me, reconciliation is a difficult word. It's one of those beautiful, glamorous words that we can theorize and theologize endlessly. But as Chuck had mentioned, it really won't mean anything unless it's grounded in the present, in the realities of the present, and all of the difficult practical work that is needed to envision and move into a future. So I think I'll pause there, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what the rest of you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Josh, would you go next, please?
Absolutely. My name is Josh Thomas. I'm the Executive Director of Kids for Peace, an interfaith youth initiative started under the leadership of Archbishop Suhail in the Diocese of Jerusalem about 20 years ago, and now also Executive Director of Seeds of Peace, with whom Kids for Peace has joined an international movement to bring young people into the process of international conflict resolution, working in the Middle East, in South Asia, and as well as across the United States and United Kingdom. And the origin story of Kids for Peace is very much one of families coming together, hoping for a better life for their own children. And I think the power in that dream that the next generation will inherit something better than the world we live in now, and a belief that new generations can be part of building a better future certainly drives the work that I do each day with thousands of young people around the world. I'm also an Episcopal priest and have served in parishes and other institutions, especially through times of conflict and transition, and bring a lot of that congregational spirit and life to my work now with these international NGOs. My own journey in this work began as a college student on a research trip to Bosnia-Herzegovina in the aftermath of the war there, and the beginnings of a kind of moral crisis about how could Christians who are taught to love their enemies do so much evil in the world, and what might be needed in order to create a new future, and to see just the physical manifestations of conflict and violence, the damage to people's physical lives, to spaces and infrastructure. And for me, reconciliation has always held sort of the weight of this damage, the weight of harm, the weight of wreckage. I was thinking about one of the young people who was accepted into a program that we were doing a number of years ago, who was so nervous to go through the airport. And we finally were asking her, a young Bosnian girl, why are you so nervous? And she said, I have a piece of a bomb in my head and I'm afraid that I'll set off the metal detector. And just that image of a young peace builder, Anna, who has a piece of violence in her and is trying to find a way to a better future. I'll have more to share later, but I think that for me, the roots of reconciliation lie in the courage to meet one another, the courage to encounter one another for the first time. And that's always, in the work of Kids for Peace, the most transformative moment I find is that first step of the journey where someone who has the violence and the conflict and the weight of injustice in their lives still chooses to find a way to come near to the other in the hopes of being able to build a better and different future together. I've been thinking a lot about reconciliation through the lens of solidarity and a commitment to journey alongside one another, shoulder by shoulder, to solve problems that affect all of us, but affect some of us more than others, because so much of the conflicts in our world are asymmetric, and those with less power and privilege are influenced more by them. And so to build, again, something better into the future, but a commitment to do that work of building together. I'll stop there for now.
Great, thank you. Kalani.
Thank you, Steve. My name is Tolani. I currently serve as the Dean of the St. Mary's Cathedral in Johannesburg, and a cathedral in which Archbishop Tutu also served as one of my predecessors as the Dean at the time. He served at the height of the apartheid experience at the time, and at the height of racial conflict. It was during that time that he served. But since then, cathedrals, by their very nature historically, are seen as centers of unity, are seen as centers of unity for the whole diocese. In most of our dioceses, as you know, we have a lot of diversities, but a cathedral is one area that needs to hold all things together, hold all diversities together, and becomes the picture in society of oneness in the midst of diversities. So working within that particular context and in a diverse city of Johannesburg, which carries all sorts of people within Africa and within South Africa and actually beyond, and you would understand that we work in a community of diversity, diverse cultures, diverse beliefs, diverse spiritualities of themselves, diverse understanding of the economics and the politics, and you are there as the cathedral in the center of it all, trying to hold it all together. The definition of, for me, of reconciliation, I think for me, we draw that definition from the act of God that is revealed in Jesus the Christ. And for me, it's about the restoration of broken relationships. And the theological model of it is that you would know that we as humanity, because of our act of sin, we had broken our relations with God, but also with nature as well. And God sent Christ himself to become the means of restoring this broken relationship between humanity and God. And also the reconciliation for me has a degree of component of healing. So which for me, healing becomes a journey to to reconciliation, or it starts with healing before one gets to actually reconcile. Because when relationships are broken, they need to be nurtured, they need to receive healing. Ultimately, people can begin to walk alongside each other. But the other component for me, I think it tells about building of relationships, because it doesn't just end with reconciling. It also has to have a continuous effort of a lifetime of building and rebuilding and nurturing relationships, which is why many of us, including our country, we'll talk about it later, we find ourselves in a resurgence of what we call racial tensions or cultural tensions, because we didn't spend time in healing and the rebuilding of relationships. We thought 1994, because Mandela came, he looked very nice. We went to the voting booth and we thought that was all. And a lot of us went to sleep. And I think that was when the church, for me, should have come alive to continue its new role to become a builder and a nurturer of relationships. I think I will pause there for now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I just wanted to mention part of the invitation that was extended to me to be a part of this is I served for 18 years in Ferguson, Missouri, and was there during the time of the slaying of Michael Brown and the work that began then that some saw as a rebirth of the civil rights movement in the United States. And so my excitement about being with all of you on the panel is rooted in how much we were able to do and how much we were not able to do, and what work needs to continue to be done. So Leah, I want to go to you next about this, really to talk about how this shows up in your work, and especially you mentioned as a practical theologian, how that shapes what you do. And also, you know, that space that you create when you're engaging from the perspective of practical theology.
Thank you, Steve. People often ask me what it's like to be a mediator. And I think probably the most honest way to say it is that mediation it can be really tedious. It is a lot of tedium, a lot of setting up meetings, a lot of just kind of holding people to come to a table and have a conversation that they don't want to have, but need to have. But it's also tedium that is shot through with rare and really beautiful moments of grace. And as a mediator, it's those moments of grace that I live for. But those, I said earlier, I struggle with this idea of reconciliation being a return to the past. These moments of grace are rarely, if ever, a nod to the past. In a mediation conversation, what you usually find is that you get a glimpse of that future. They act as a hinge. Alistair talked about reconciliation offering a foretaste of heaven. And I think sometimes if we're lucky, we see a bit of that in these difficult and tedious conversations that we have to hold as mediators. And I think what this hinge in a mediation opens up for us is the possibility of treading really carefully, of really grappling with what is before us in the present tense, so that we can find the right way to navigate in order to reach that other future. As I was coming into this session, I was reflecting that quite recently, in the past couple of years, I've received a lot of requests to take commissions through my consultancy practice that involve designing and managing a quote unquote reconciliation process, oftentimes for an institution that has been experiencing a lot of negative press around historic abuse, historic institutional abuse of all types. So there are these really difficult conversations that are needed between the institution and the survivors. And I always urge the institution to drop the pressure on the word reconciliation, because I think it is sometimes too much too soon. Sometimes I think this really great vision of reconciliation can get in the way of the practicalities that need to happen in order to reach that goal. So instead, I try to reframe it. I might say, for instance, to the survivors that I work with, How could your story be honored? What would be a meaningful way, a truly meaningful way for this institution to move into the future? Crucially, how might this translate into practical actions? And I think from there, we can start to build up both a sustainable, but also a very honest understanding of what reconciliation might be for a very fractured and traumatized community.
Thank you. Josh, the work centers with young people. You said its genesis had to do with families wanting a better place. And we know that there is a clear sense Jesus had that we could learn so much if we would be in a place of the child. So are there particular things that you would share that have to do with reconciliation as understood and expressed and developed by young people?
Yeah, there are. I think what I've experienced and work with young people, especially the younger that they are, is that they can move quickly into a space of new relationships, that there is a curiosity that folks have to meet others who are different from them, including others who are part of an identity group that has historically been an enemy or in conflict. We found with Kids for Peace, for instance, when we're working with children who are 9, 10, 11 years old, that it takes them only a day or so to break through all of the barriers and the divides that people have told them that they're supposed to be enemies. People have told them stories about the other, but there's a little bit of a spark and a spunk in young people to not quite believe what their parents are telling them and to want to find out for themselves. And that desire to learn, that desire to find out for themselves, I think is a really powerful resource in this work. I think about George, a Palestinian Christian who's been part of Kids for Peace, who later on, after he was part of the program for a few years, he confessed that the reason he joined was that he had heard all of these negative stereotypes about Jewish Israelis. He wanted to prove to himself that they were true. And he found along the way that the stereotypes weren't quite as true as he has been taught, and that he made some good friendships and relationships that disproved those negative assumptions and stereotypes that they had inherited. People learn to hate, people learn to fear, and by providing alternative relationships and data points early in someone's life, we can begin to steer them in some new directions of openness, curiosity, respect, and also commitment to one another. And simultaneously with that, we see certainly in the United States and in other places, though, around the world as well, that young people are growing up in contexts that are more and more homogenous, and the opportunities to meet people who are different from them are fewer. And so the role of organizations like ours to create opportunities for folks to come together across these lines of difference, race, socioeconomic status, religion, national identity, and background, the convening, the gathering, the hosting of these moments of encounter is more and more important to be able to break down those deep social divisions and also help inculcate a sense of responsibility, which is the last thing I would say that we're finding, I would say more and more young people with a passion and a fire and a desire to do something to make this world a better place, to seek justice, to seek healing, to seek a future that they feel excited about. And they are longing for some coaching, some mentoring, some opportunities to be able to activate on those desires. The other thing that I find and work with young people is they hold my feet to the fire to be more optimistic than I might be otherwise. And like conflict management is not super interesting if somebody who's 15 or 16, they want to change the world and build a future with justice and equity. And that vision that comes from them, I think is something that we need to honor because it is a fire for change. It's a fire for justice. It's a fire for a better world that, especially when you get lots and lots and lots of them together and can build on that energy, there's some possibility. Heat can melt and transform systems that have been frozen, can begin to form unlikely relationships where people are willing to act with courage and to take risk. I have hundreds and hundreds of stories of young people standing up in the face of bullying, standing up in the face of chance demonizing the other side, being willing to put themselves on the line to stand up for people that they now have a relationship with. And again, those relationships of solidarity, a sense of mutual commitment, as they take root among young people, I think they provide a massive resource to be able to bring to bear as we move towards a better future. The flip side of this is also true. Young people are being enlisted as partisan in ways that are teaching them very exclusivist and very negative views of others. And there's a malleability to young people's lives, spirits, and habits that make them a force for positive, and also the risk of being recruited to someone's agenda that will be destructive to themselves and to others.
Thank you. Kalani, you talked about the great tradition and legacy of the Cathedral and your service there, and before you, predecessors, and the sense that things were at a high point in thinking that in the earlier time of President Mandela, that there would be a huge breakthrough, and you're discovering that there continues to be a lot of work to do. Your image of this call to be a place of unity is a really powerful one. And I wonder if you have any advice or wisdom for people who are in the midst of that in-between time. We're about to be in Advent, and so it's, in-between time. It's a recognition of what is to come, or what the hoped for and believed future will be, and a recognition also of our not there-ness. So I wonder what kind of wisdom you could share for people who are in the midst of that in-between time.
Yeah. I think for us and our context, if I may put it in context, as you know, historically, we had various nature of brokenness. One, of course, the key one was racial. We discovered we also had an ethnic hat in the past that didn't receive much attention because we were all looking at the racial one. But also in terms of faith, there was faith brokenness, where one faith was seen as more important than other faiths. But of course, the issue of gender as well was one area of brokenness. So to begin with, it will depend with which one you are addressing and how you actually navigate. But drawing from his historical one in terms of the key one, which was the racial one, and all the others actually follows, is that when 94 came, as you know, one of the things that were introduced in our own context was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, the objective of that was to actually find out the truth, so that you may be able to then see, which forms of injustice were committed, how they were committed, but all of it was aimed at restoring relationships. But you can't begin there without beginning in the truth. So in my experiences, there are various stages that we need to get to. One is in our journey of building relationships and building reconciliation, and somehow I'll address the question that you are saying. One is acceptance that there's a problem, because many a times we don't want to accept that there's a brokenness program, particularly we who believe in Jesus Christ. We like playing God and spirituality so much, and we never want to address the real issues. And then we actually always cover them with prayer and spirituality and never address the real issues. And we discovered post 94 that one of the things that needed to be done was acceptance of the problem, which is where TRC came from. But once we accept the problem, there needs to be penitence. Those who are perpetrators need to be able to come to a sense of penitence. And when there's penitence, there needs to be repentance. And when you see sincere repentance, it is then that those who are victims are able to open their hearts and minds to offer that gift of actual reconciliation, and in turn receive the gift of healing for themselves. So in our own context, therefore, we then thought everything was right, but now we are beginning to see that in actual fact, there are stages in what I've just outlined that we jumped, you know, and we went with the whole aroma and the whole excitement of the new South Africa, the new democratic South Africa, but there were practical things that we needed to do. And this in our own context, we discovered it in our diocese about 5 years ago, that, you know, even though we had a new South Africa, even though we were one church, but in essence, racially, we were different churches. Ethnically, we were different churches. In terms of gender, we were different churches. And therefore, we had to actually begin introducing a system that we called Puelano. Puelano is a Sotho name, which simply means coming back together, which we recognize that we had to do practical things. And one of the things we did in our own context was to restructure how our church worked in terms of archdeacons. Instead of having, you know, one community divided by race or divided by ethnicity, we began to change even the canons of the rules to cross boundaries in terms of archdeaconries to ensure that there is cross-cultural interaction and cross-cultural experience in what we're doing. So that instead of having one gender there or one racial community worshiping together, always being suspicious of the other and the vice versa, we began to say, it's about time we need to be together. So one of the ways for me to achieve reconciliation is always to try and do things together, spend time together, so that you are able to learn from each other. The assumptions may actually be addressed and the perceptions about each other may actually be addressed. So what I'm advocating for in this journey of reconciliation is that we need to be able to come to a level of doing practical, doable things and move from a wholly theological and theoretical world. But what are the practical things, practical steps, practical actions, practical initiatives that we need to introduce in local communities? And that is why one of the challenges now in our own context, we have a lot of contingency and men and women from within Africa who have become an integrated part of our communities. But that does not come with its own challenges. But as I'm saying, we have to work on it in practical steps to be able to actually achieve that reconciliation and that particular healing. One of the challenges we're dealing with now where we are is that we've seen even in church schools, there's been a resurgence of racial tensions, cultural tensions, you know, even in our own churches, even in our own society. Recently within South Africa, we're having one after the other in various communities, especially, of course, influenced by politics. But it says to us, we have to get back to basics. We have to get back to work. And the church needs to take a lead. And I'll share later what are my thoughts on how the church needs to take that particular lead.
Great, thank you so much. Alistair, you framed for us some different levels or different frames for engagement, things to think about, whether it's interpersonal or interpersonal on up to a kind of cosmic sense of this. How do you see an engagement? How do you kind of come to understand where in that sort of spectrum you start the work?
Well, I think the simple answer is I think there is always a discernment needed at a local level. And I'd really like to build on what Zolani's just been saying. For me, in terms of the church, it's key to see the church's mission as part of joining in with the reconciliation work that God is already doing in the world. And to understand that the Holy Spirit is at work throughout the world, well beyond the church. And so part of the challenge for every local church is an exercise of discernment about what are we called to. And I wonder if I can just share with you a way of thinking about the church's mission as a journey towards greater reconciliation. I've just got a little slide here, which I hope might be helpful. So Leah will be familiar with this because she's seen this before. But I think often in the church, we start with trying to meet some basic needs. And that's good, but it's never enough. Partly because sometimes we can create some dependency, but partly because there are structural issues that might be causing those needs, and those need to be explored. And so a second stage on the journey is looking to raise some awareness of injustice, and from there to move on to being prepared to challenge the system, to say, actually, this is not right, we're not happy with the way things are. And then to be looking to move to negotiating some change in the way things happen, so that they are more just, that there's a fairer society. And that takes us on to experiencing something of a foretaste of heaven here on earth. And so for me, I really like what Zolani was saying, but I think there's a real challenge for each individual local gathering of the church to work out, so what is our contribution going to be? And how can we sort of move on this journey? And if I can just give a little example of one. So I had a fabulous conversation earlier this year with somebody called Ali Angus, who leads something called Eco Church in a church in South London. And one of the things that they have been doing is recognizing there is a basic need for us to connect more with the earth, and to be more connected, particularly those of us who live in cities. But there's also a need to understand, what does it mean to live in a more ecologically friendly way on the planet? And to recognize that we may need to be part of working with those who are protesting against the sort of unjust way that our system is, our economic systems are working, and looking to negotiate change. And some of that can be very small at a local level, you know, deciding that we're going to create a garden in part of our church's land and invite people in the community to be helping to work that. But also there's a need to, you know, help to campaign, to ask governments and leaders of governments to be taking brave decisions to address some of the big ecological challenges facing us globally. So I hope that might be helpful as a sort of responding to what you were saying, Steve.
Thank you. Yes. Chuck, I have kind of two parts to this, and one is the sense that we who are here in the United States have had a pretty dramatic season that has heightened difference and disconnection and not connection, not right relationship. And so I wonder if you have reflections on that. And then the second part is a question that all of you, I hope, will respond to, but Cynthia Burrows is wondering about the particular way that congregations of color can move forward in the journey of reconciliation. And in the context of the United States, this has been a part of, if not a central part of, the distinct and different narratives that have been positioned from these two very separate views of the world.
Yeah, I saw Cynthia's question as well as Catherine's before her, and I appreciate that, Cynthia, and I'm hoping we will dive into that one. Going to what you first were talking about, Steve, certainly we have all of us seen the past year has been an extraordinary year, but the past several years, the rate of polarization has been pretty extraordinary. In 2003, in her book, Madam Secretary, Madeleine Albright spoke of the fact that even then, 2003, that we live in a culture, in a time when our technology has allowed us to simply listen to things that reinforce our own opinions. We can choose our news, we can choose our outlets, and in fact, nowadays, for folks who may have been watching some recent documentaries, those who have some control over technology know how to make use of that and just continue to reinforce what we already agree on, what we already think about, which means we get to surround ourselves with in a kind of an echo chamber. And this can be really deadly. And what we've seen in the past few years leading up to an extraordinary election has been the fact that we are very much polarized. And not just here, but in so many parts of the world. Following Alistair's lead, I want to share a screen real quickly and share it on this particular piece, which is a slide I often use with groups. Comes from Susan Carpenter and William Kennedy's work on managing public disputes. And nowhere is this better needed and more needed than in the church, but also in the wider society. It looks at the fact that we don't have 10,000 things we argue about. We have a few, but because we reinforce our own opinions so strongly and so much, we just become, in essence, stuck. So as we hit X, whatever X is, as we hit it each time, if we don't find a way to manage this, to work through this, to find some way to really communicate deeply with one another about this, if we don't do that, then the intensity level that we bring to the argument is going to increase dramatically. And this is the piece that's most fascinating and, to be honest, most chilling. This seventh level, where the perceptions of reality become distorted. This is when it is no longer a matter of me saying, I'm for X, you're against X, I think you're wrong. So I've been saying, I think you're crazy, I totally disagree with what you're saying. No, it is suddenly a matter of me saying, I am right, God is on my side, and you are a traitor, a heretic, enemy with a capital E. This is a dangerous place to be. And this is why I said at the outset that we have to be detectives. We have to look at where are we in any given situation of conflict and recognize where we are at it in that moment, but also where others engaged in that moment are at. And the fact is, if I'm feeling like my intensity level is still low on that spiral of conflict, and I start saying, oh, let's come to the table. Let's work on unity here. Let's work on unity. Let's share stories. If I'm at that level, and yet the person I'm dealing with is at level 7, then they are going to simply hear that as, oh, Chuck's trying to trick me, bring me in closer, start to dance with me in order to get that knife in deeper. Because at that point, there's a level of unreality, and I am simply the enemy. So in dealing with so many conflicts, whether in the church, which, by the way, for me is always more difficult than in other parts of society. I bet Leah may or may not agree with me on that, but I do both as well, or I have done both. And we always bring God into it. And when we bring God into it, God's always on our side, my side, not our side globally. So if we run a danger as we go further along in that, which means what we ultimately need is something that Josh brought up much earlier about with the kids. We've got to come to a place where we're actually dealing with one human being with another, or 10 human beings, or 30 human beings, where we get past 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And that is hard work. I'll stop there. I may come back to some of that.
No, thank you for that. We were blessed in the Ferguson work to have a lot of folks show up with expertise. And one of them attributed this to somebody who's just recently died that maybe some of our colleagues know about, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who said that, and this goes to Kalani, part of what I heard with you, that get people working on things together, that we have a notion somehow that if we get people talking and discussing and doing that, that'll do it. But his idea is to get people working on things, hands together. And that as you work together on things, heart came next. People started to make that heart connection. And then eventually they could engage differences of perspective, worldview. And so not surprisingly, the thing I think we did most in Ferguson is created meals and got people sharing meals together. And when their children were running around or they were, talking to one another across tables, then that was the place where we could start bringing the police and the community together and to have some really tough conversations. And so food was our way in, but it was that hands first, heart second, head last. So we're moving along at a great clip. really knowing that, having been a part of these conversations, that we have some questions that have arisen. One of them from Catherine is really about this idea that we have from Matthew in this 5th chapter about the challenge to leave your gift at the altar before you offer that gift and go into a place of reconciliation. And so that's a very crisp image. And I'm wondering if each of you would share a moment where you really saw the work of reconciliation, or however you describe that, active and alive, that sort of sacramental place of an outward sign of an inward grace. I'll just leave it open. Who would like to go first?
I'll gladly dive in on that. And then I want to hear from the others. When we were going through the culture wars in the church, and again, the horrible phrase, but I've used, so many people use that, but when we were going through some significant difference from people of strong faith in different places on issues of human sexuality, on interpretation of scripture. There were many times in which I had both the privilege and the challenge of meeting with groups who were talking about whether to stay in the Episcopal Church or to leave. And I remember in one particular situation, we started to meet at lunchtime, over lunch, to begin a long conversation. And I didn't know them, they didn't know me, but I was asked to come and be part of this conversation as they were going to make some decisions with the leadership there. And I remember one person, as the priest invited me to, said, well, would the canon lead us in prayer? And a particular leader in the group said, under his breath, but loud enough to be heard, that is, if he knows how to pray. Again, when you're at a certain level of, you're not dealing with 3-dimensional human beings, you're dealing with 2-dimensional. And so assumptions were made. I chose not to respond to that. I did pray. Lightning did not strike the house or anything. And as we moved forward, we spent the next several hours, and then in the end, it was almost 9 hours talking. The first thing I asked them, though, was, could we go around the room, tell me your name, and just tell me briefly how Jesus has been real in your life this week. And it was just a way to get us to talk about something, anything other than the thing that we knew we were going to have some struggle with. Then we were able, after that took some time, then to be able to say, now let's really address some things. 9 hours later, or 8.5 hours later, that one person, that one gentleman looked at me and said, well, not sure I agree with you on a lot of things, but I don't distrust you anymore. And notice that. It wasn't I trust you, but I don't distrust you. I love that double negative. And I remember I just said then, well, that's a good place for us to be, huh? They ended up staying in the Episcopal Church. They ended up being a vital part of the rebuilding of the diocese. It was a wonderful group and a wonderful place, is a wonderful place. But I found it very interesting. Sometimes the success of reconciliation is not heaven on earth. Sometimes it is reaching a powerful step that says, I don't distrust you, which means we're starting to move from 2 dimensions to 3. And that's not a bad place to be.
Great, thank you. Who else would share a story or a moment?
Yes, I'll go.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
Yes, please.
I think I want to draw, when you link that particular text, I think for me, one of the things that come from that text, and I'll move forward, is that it speaks into the essence of what the Christianity is all about. That Christianity is not an individualistic religion. It is a religion which is rooted and grounded on the aspect of community. And that is why, therefore, I think Scripture understood humanity, even before humanity was born, because I think it understood that when one or two are gathered, there is bound to be brokenness at some point, at somewhere. And that is why I think the call to many of us, before you make your offering, reconcile with one another. In essence, reconciliation and being in good relationship must become one of our critical aspects of building community, especially faith communities. Because as you know, that brokenness of relationships, as I said, happens in all spheres. So for me, that's one thing actually important, that it is a religion of community. You know, I know that some theological perspective, we will say, if one person is saved and they go to heaven alone, that's okay. But I believe differently. I believe you'll be bored alone in heaven. So you'll never survive alone. You need us. So you need us in order to enjoy heaven. So it is a community relationship. All we do must be in community. And therefore the scripture says to us, building relationships, restoring relationships must be the actually core. So it must be part of the critical role that the church plays. Remember also that if you look at our faith as the Christian faith, it is rooted and grounded on the model of Christ. And if you want to understand what the model of Christ is the model of love. So we cannot say we love God, go and make offering to God, when we can't even look at each other. You know, we can't even talk to one another in the congregation. In other way, it says, sort your relationships first before you come to me. You know, and that is why, that is how I actually understand it. But one of the things, of course, it goes beyond, for me, this reconciliation, beyond just within Christianity. It calls us as well to say, even though we're a Christian community, remember, you do not exist in isolation. You know, we are a world of multi-religious and multicultural world, and therefore we need to be able to restore relationships, and it becomes an important part of ours, even with other religions. And one story that I may share as I conclude just this part, we buried one of the stalwarts a couple of years ago at Cathedral in South Africa, who was actually of an Islam faith, was an ANC member, one of the Rivonia trialist people, went to Robben Island, the Mandela era people. And when he passed away here, at his funeral, all religious communities were there. But something powerful, two things for me powerful happened, which talks about the global community, multi-religious, is that they allowed the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town to preach at an Islamic service in an Islamic church, but they allowed the Archbishop to actually preach the gospel of Christ. And I said, that's religious maturity. And the second thing that they did, when they laid in the tradition where all men will kneel, and they put all of us in the row, all religious leaders, from the Jewish community, Hindu community, Christian community, including political leaders, on one line, and got us to pray together. That is where the world should go to, where we can be different, but know that we are one humanity and walk together.
Amen.
Amen, Kalani.
Alistair, I think you were signaling you would like to share something.
Yeah, I guess I've got a sort of very much more mundane example. So thinking personally, there was a period a number of years ago where I felt very deeply hurt by an older family member. I don't need to go into the details, but I was, yeah, felt very, very mistreated and badly hurt by some things that he did. And I went, you know, I working in the field of reconciliation, I was having to work at how do I deal with what's going on within me, and you know, went on a journey of sort of coming to terms with the hurt that I was feeling, and then taking the initiative to have a conversation with him and to confront him with the hurt that I felt I'd experienced. He wouldn't accept my take on things. And but I got it off my chest, and at least it was a sort of start of a journey inside me. And so what I found I had to work at, and it was really about a 2-year journey, was a continual commitment to want to be reconciled to him, to forgive him for the hurt I felt I'd experienced, even though he wasn't taking any responsibility for it. And I'm glad to say that I do now feel reconciled to him and have a good relationship with him. But it was not a, in terms of the verse that's quoted, if I hadn't gone to worship, it would have been quite a long time before I went to worship until I was reconciled to him. But it was, it was a journey of reaching a place of greater reconciliation with him.
Thank you. Leah.
Thank you, Catherine, for bringing that gospel passage to our attention. I really love that idea of how the gifts we would bring to God are sanctified by having the courage to encounter the people that we're struggling with. It's such a beautiful story. When you put it up there, I was reminded of a mediation case that I did a few years ago. I used to live in East London, which is a very diverse, very religiously diverse, very hugely multicultural. It was one of the most terrifying mediation cases I've ever done. It was between two Bangladeshi Muslim families. I do not speak the language, so I was mediating entirely through a translator. These families were hugely at war with each other. The police had been involved at some point. One of the families couldn't sort childcare, so her toddler was there in the room with us. And to top it all off, the electric kettle was broken, which meant no tea or coffee for anyone. It was a really, really challenging situation to have to hold, particularly as I was mediating in a language I do not speak, having to very much rely on the translator. And it was one of those cases where you just think this is going to go nowhere. There's no good outcome from the situation. And then I spoke earlier about mediation being tedium with rare moments of grace. And for me, this really encapsulates that, that the toddler started crying, and the mother of the other family walked over and handed him her mobile phone so he could play with it. And that one moment just changed the entire tenor of the conversation. It was beautiful. It unlocked things enough that we could start taking very small steps forward, just enough to get by, to make it to the next stage. But crucially, and Chuck had this wonderful phrase earlier, what it meant is for the people in the room who were really at odds with each other, they went from being two-dimensional to three-dimensional. And for me, it was one of those situations where I just had to give thanks to God, because that was none of my doing. It was absolutely none of my doing this in a different language without a kettle or coffee or tea. It really was pure grace.
Thank you. Josh.
Yeah, I was actually going to follow a similar path and talk about moments of grace, or when bits of the gospel seem to break through. And part of reconciliation, I think, is being ready to say yes to those moments. I was thinking with rather than this is always work or something that we proactively figure out how to do in the tedium, which is, I think, what a lot of it is. There's also these moments when you have a choice to make. And I was thinking a number of years ago in Kids for Peace in Jerusalem, we were organizing dinners in each other's homes for religious holidays. And so during Ramadan, the Muslim families would host the Jews and the Christians, and vice versa during Easter and Christmas and Hanukkah. And there was this time at the end of a Ramadan meal late into the night, right? It didn't start until after sundown. And the family had gone, a bunch of Jewish Christian families had gone to a Muslim home, and it's 8 p.m., 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. And of course, what's the question that the 13-year-old asks their mom and dad, can I sleep over their house tonight? Right? And like, imagine being in the position of a parent thinking about safety and who is this person and are they my enemy, and all of the gyrations that they had to go to even to get to this dinner in a neighborhood where they didn't even know where the neighborhood was. Would they be safe parking their car outside? How do I find the house? Because there's no house numbers or street names. And the families said yes in that night. I mean, they kept their phones on and were like nervous at home, but there was something like these moments come around every once in a while to turn the two-dimensional into three-dimensional, have another layer of relationship with people. And I have been struck by the power when folks have had the courage to say yes in those moments and to take a bit of a leap of faith.
Thank you. I actually want to share a quick story, and then I'm going to ask each of you as panelists as we close to share any resources that you might have for people. There's a lively chat going on, so you could put things in there too for people, and we'll get those out to them. But one year for Lent, I decided that my sense of Islam was very limited. And so I committed to practicing those parts of Islam that could be practiced without making the claim that I was Muslim. This was picked up as a story. It was not a popular story with many people. It ended up on the front page of our local paper. And there was a member of the congregation I served who was a retired Marine, who was profoundly Islamophobic, and was also the person that was over on people's roofs or brought a wrench or constantly responding to the needs of others. And so on a Saturday morning, we had planned, back to the food part, we had planned a gathering for the community, and I was in making pancakes. And he came into that setting and got busy sort of anticipating what would help me be better at making the pancakes. So I never ran out of batter. I always had plates to put them on. He never once said to me what I assumed felt about me making this gesture. And I was so awed by his response that I didn't take that step and say, are we going to talk about this, Jim? And it became a moment in our relationship, in that sense of his being present and willing to be there, and both of us knowing how different we were about this, that just opened up a whole new sense of the grace that's been mentioned several times, that comes unexpected and undeserved. With that being said, let's just go back and Kalani, would you start? Are there things, we'll go back reverse order from the beginning. So are there things that you would share for people that are resources that for people who are engaged with this conversation today and want to continue to be about this work?
I think for us at the moment, we are drawing from the resources of being part of Heritage, as it addresses various aspects and various issues. So at the moment, we might not have really resources, particularly to the Cathedral, but we are drawing on resources in terms of Heritage. But one of the practical things we've committed ourselves to actually work on is both as a local community and as a diocese, is to be intentional in terms of building relationships and initiatives in terms of cross-cultural and cross-ministry exposure is one of the things one is trying to push from the clergy perspective, to say we need to do more and more of those where we expose our clergy to various communities, various experiences, so that it may benefit the communities where they find themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. Josh.
Do you want one of others to pick things up, Steve?
Yes, please go ahead.
Here we go. Sorry. Thank you. You've got it fixed. Just to say sorry, I'm having some technical issues. Too many people on Zoom in my house today. Just Kids for Peace and Seeds of Peace both have programs available for young people to join, both online short courses that are available at k4p.org, as well as face-to-face programs in the US and the UK, which is where it seems a lot of people here are from. And so I'll put those links in the chat as well, and would love to also resource congregations that are looking for curriculum ideas, program ideas that you can use to forge some initial outreach to people around you, especially around interfaith relationships, which is areas of specialty. So I'll put those in the chat, and would love to work with anyone on doing local programs in your congregation.
Great, thank you. Leah.
I wasn't planning to do this, and it's going to sound like a shameless piece of self-promotion, and I beg your forgiveness, but actually it does feel relevant given some of the themes about interfaith dialogue that have come up toward the end of our conversation. I am the general editor of this book, Mapping Faith, Theologies of Migration and Community. It was published in June. It is a dialogue about migration and theology and community between the three largest Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Islam, Christianity. I commissioned over 35 writers, poets, and artists to be part of this project. And it was just a great joy to be part of this, to preside over it. As we were moving through this session, I was reminded of one of the poems in the book written by Pádraig Ó Tuama, who is a Catholic theologian and poet based in Belfast in Northern Ireland. He, until very recently, was the leader of the Coromila community, which is one of the largest and oldest centers of reconciliation in Northern Ireland. So I just want to read just an excerpt from one of the poems that he very kindly contributed to this book. The poem is called Aftermath. There was conflict, yes, and we moved from there to here, yes, and we did not have a map, and we did not know the language of our own survival, and I didn't know where your remains were, and we did not know how to reach each other, because underneath us, the ground moved. In fact, it blew up. Yes, yes, yes. This is what happens when wars happen. People fall apart, yes. Earth shifts, places open up. The center is now the edge. Did I tell you I survived?
Wonderful, thank you. Chuck.
Wow, this has been very rich, and I love that poem. Thank you for that, Leah. You know, there's so many great resources out there, and we will certainly be sending out some different things. I still think that managing public disputes, from which I quoted talking about that spiral of conflict earlier, still stands up as an incredible one. It is not born out of the church. It is born out of very much looking at disputes, public disputes in corporations, in politics, etc. And maybe because of that, I find it very powerful to make use of, as Paul, the Apostle Paul, made use of so many things in the society around him. I also think that my own boss came out with a book this fall, Love is the Way. Bishop Michael Curry has been a voice for very much a voice, not just in the Episcopal Church, not just in Anglicanism, but in this country and beyond, a voice for what it can mean to talk about love, not as sentiment, but very much as a bit of hard work, loving God, loving one another, loving ourselves. And he often has reminded me of the importance of going back to Dr. King, and especially Dr. King's 10 Commandments. For those who are going out, and one of those saying that, in fact, number 2, after talking number 1 about meditating daily on the teachings and life of Jesus, the very second one is, and remember always that the nonviolent movement in Birmingham seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. As long as we're dealing with two-dimensional opponents out there, we're always going to be thinking in very black and white terms, very much in victory or defeat. Us versus them, win or lose, but to really talk about reconciliation from the point of Jesus is to really go deeper, which means doing what we were talking about in our stories, starting to see the other as another human being, as a beloved child of God, with whom I may disagree, but a beloved child of God. And last but not least, I think it also means letting go of my own sense of infallibility, even just a little bit.
Great. Thank you. Alistair.
So I'm going to do a shameless plug like Leah. So I've got a book which, it's probably the reverse way around, but it's you'll get an idea from the cover if you see the cover. So the book's called Bridge Building, Making Peace with Conflict in the Church. Each chapter has a dialogue with a dialogue partner. Leah is in fact one of my dialogue partners on one of the chapters. And each chapter ends with a theological reflection based on a particular sort of passage of scripture. So for those of you who are really wanting to make scriptural connections, you might find that that useful. And I posted the a link to it on Amazon's website on the in the chat.
Great, thank you very much. Well, beyond a blessing to be with you all and a call to listen more deeply to what it would mean to be people in this work and the particular context that we are in. I'm grateful for even more learning about Hard Edge and the kind of work that is shared and developed and enhanced by that commitment that has been made by many. I'm especially thankful to Joe Swimmer, who as the executive director of CEAP convened this event and also has convened many other wonderful events. I would only add that these are available and they'll be posted tomorrow in US time, I guess tomorrow in the morning. So please, for those of you who are captivated by bits and pieces of this and also like me, maybe couldn't keep up with your note taking, there'll be a chance to listen to this again. Chuck, did you have something to say?
No, just a huge thank you to Joe, but also not just for this, but for CEAP's leadership throughout this year, this strange, surreal year. CEAP, along with other organizations, has really stepped up to offer so many wonderful options and opportunities for folks. So I'm deeply grateful. And grateful to you, Steve, for moderating this panel.
It's wonderful to be with you all, and blessings. And for some of you, good sleep. So, goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.